By supporting On My Mind, you help us bring you thoughtful, fact-based conversations whenever and wherever you listen. I'd like to invite you to make a contribution today at dianerehm.org/donate. And thank you. Hi, it's Diane. On my mind, Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States. She's the first Native American to hold the post and only the second appointed to a third term. A member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, Harjo has written 9 books of poetry as well as a memoir, Crazy Brave. Harjo also plays the saxophone and has released 7 albums, including last year's I Pray for My Enemies. Her latest book, Poet Warrior, mixes prose, poetry, songs, and dreams to trace her evolution as an artist and fighter for justice. Harjo says if she has one goal in her work, it's for Native people to be seen as human beings. Joy Harjo joined me in December 2021 as part of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Joy Harjo, I'm so glad to have you with me. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here this December, afternoon.
Afternoon, indeed. Tell me where you are.
I am in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
The first section of your book, Poet Warrior, is called Ancestral Roots. Tell us about your ancestral roots and why it was so important for you to begin this book there.
I think because we all begin with ancestral roots, and every one of us. I think because I was a grandmother in my 30s and I'm now a great-grandmother, it's allowed me to see and understand that a family is a field, like a story field, and their connections and the storylines weave through. It's allowed me to see that kind of in a way where it goes and where it comes from. So these ancestral roots are in lands and they're with people. And my mother's side is very different from my father's side. My mother came from sharecroppers. She's essentially, a European mix with some Cherokee. And she liked to sing. And she loved poetry. And my father's side were Muskogee Creek, and there's some European in there too, but Muskogee Creek citizens, and were leaders. My grandfather, I think it's I'm the 6th generation from him, fought Andrew Jackson against the illegal move of our people from the Southeast to Indian Territory, interim chiefs and painters. And they looked down on my mother, his family. It's an old story, looked down on my mother's family because they had, I guess, more stature, and my mother used to pick in the fields. But I think we're all full of contradictions. I mean, I think that's what makes it so difficult for this country to move, coherently, is because each of us is an amazing field of contradictions. And then you put all that together into, communities, and it makes for good story.
You have written that your family, your tribe, was removed unlawfully from the lands. So difficult for everyone involved.
It is. And it doesn't just end with that generation, because, every story has a kind of conclusion. And so if something is unresolved, it's like an unresolved chord in music. It hangs there with angst until someone picks it up and finds a way, not necessarily to make sense of it, because there are some stories, as we know, as human beings, that will never make sense, no matter how we tell them. And it's important to tell them. There has to be some kind of resolve in the telling. And I think that's part of what I'm doing in Poet Warrior. It may not have been my absolute original intention, except that I was following the story. And I, like all of us, we come into this world with questions like, where do I come from? Why are we here? Where
Of
are we going?
course.
What does it matter?
You know, we think of poetry as coming from the mind and from the heart, and yet the idea of poet warrior is a pretty strong title. Why did you go there? Why did you choose that?
The title I chose was For Justice, for Love. And my wonderful editor, Jill Bialowski, who's been with me almost since the beginning, said Poet Warrior.
Huh.
And because that was the coming of age name of the character that's really part of me, who coming, winding through the story in poetry, her name, the name was given to her as Poet Warrior. I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense, because who is a warrior? For so many, when you conjure up the image of warrior, it's often males who go to war. But a warrior is someone who stands up for the people. And sometimes that is a mother with children trying to figure out how she's going to make it from day to day, and getting up and packing lunches and getting the children to school, going to work and coming back, sometimes with no help at all, or a refugee coming in and trying to find a way when, they were moved from their homelands by violence. So there's all kinds of warriors, and the concept of most warriors, if you get to the moment of actually a combat, it's gone too far.
Would you read for us your poem titled Prepare, that's on page 3 of your book?
Okay. Yes, this opens up the whole book. And I always, in whatever book I do, I like to open with a kind of preparation, or even blessing, or asking for a blessing. Prepare. The first earth gift of breathing opened your body, these lungs, this heart, gave birth to the ability to interact with dreaming. You are a story fed by generations. You carry songs of grief, triumph, thankfulness, and joy. Feel their power as they ascend within you, as you walk, run swiftly, even fly into infinite possibility. Let go that which burdens you. Let go any acts of unkindness or brutality from or against you. Let go that which has burdened your family, your community, your nation, or disturbed your soul. Let go one breath into another. Pray thankfulness for this earth we are, for this becoming we are, for this sunlight touching skin we are, for the cooling of the dark we are. Listen now as earth sheds her skin. Listen as the generations move one against the other to make power. We are bringing in a new story. We will be accompanied by ancient songs and will celebrate together. Breathe this new dawn, assist it as it opens its mouth to breathe.
It's so important to hear you say again and again, let go. And yet, for so many people, so difficult to let go.
Yes.
And yet, you urge people to find it in themselves, a way to let go.
Yes, because so many of the beliefs we hold might work for another time or another situation, and they get congested, and you cannot see what's right here, what's in front of us sometimes because of impacted debris, impacted historical debris that gets in our way.
How did you move from the impacted historical debris to find your way to the freedom of writing poetry? You began as a painter. Mm-hmm. How did that allow you to free yourself to move into song, into poetry?
That was quite a process. But I remember at that point, I was always quiet and never said much and sat in the back and hid behind my hair and anything else. And painting, I loved painting. I could paint all night. But at some point, poetry happened. I heard native poets for the first time while I was at the University of New Mexico, and I needed it. Around the same time that I realized I was having a breakdown, though I didn't have the luxury of a breakdown, so I couldn't break down. And I kept moving, even though every moment sometimes was filled with absolute terror. I would keep moving because I had two children. And if something happened to me, there would be no one there for them. So I just kept moving. And that's when I started. I was going to say I took a pen in my hand, but we had typewriters then. And sometimes I write longhand and sometimes I wrote on a typewriter or later computer. I do both. But I always loved poetry. And I started going to a lot of performances and started writing my own poetry when I heard other Native poets, heard Native poets for the first time and thought, wow, as much as I love Emily Dickinson, she was still far away from me. She could speak to me intimately, but at the same time, I didn't hear her and think, I can write poetry. We had no poets that I knew in our neighborhood. Maybe we did. We had my mother who wrote lyrics, but it started there and I came through. It helped me. The thing about writing, and which is about taking time with ourselves, however we do it, and with whatever art, is that it's about listening. You know, even if you're painting or learning how to fix an engine, you know, in a car or whatever, it's all about listening. And so writing poetry gave me it. What you know, it helped me understand what that was. And I had to go through a series, almost like a series of doorways of reckoning. It doesn't end. This process still goes on, you know, with all of us. And it goes on and on, but it gave me a tool to say, okay, now, as I'm like half very intellectual, logical, and I'm half a dreamer. So then my other side came in and says, okay, what is this? What can you do about it? And then I understood that there were unspeakable things. And sometimes it's the unspeakable that poetry addresses with words. And that's how poetry allowed me to move into what is unspeakable, to give voice. And those impactions began, you know, opening.
You write about your mother and her first marriage, and then meeting someone else, your stepfather. You write about your stepfather, and it's not a pretty picture. Tell us about him.
Yes, I had a step sister who's gone now, but when I read her, I sent her Crazy Brave, my earlier memoir. She said, it was a lot worse than you wrote it. And sometimes there's no, I don't like writing about difficult things, even though it's a way to move through them. But I tried to understand him. And there's a moment in the book where I'm sitting after his funeral with my stepsister, his daughter, who helped me because he was the same way to her, constantly, you know, in battle, in a way, I guess, in a kind of battle with her, and repressive, very repressive. And we were trying to understand him because he forbid me to sing in the house. Our house used to be full of singing. My mother was a songwriter, and when he came into the scene, there was no more singing.
Why?
I don't know, but it was about something about control. So as we sat out in my car, we were talking about his story. And this is what I love about writing, because I don't know what's going to happen. Even if, I was there in the scene and I'm a memoirist and I'm writing this, but I'm following because insights come and they come along a line or a movement of language and images. And I didn't know this until I landed right on it when I was writing that section, trying to understand this evil person and realizing, or a man, he wasn't all evil, but who would, what he was carrying. And then I said, I wrote, even the monster has a story. And I thought, thank you for that, because it made me stop. And that's, that's for me, that's the power of writing, because it's about a kind of listening. It's about listening. And I listened and I wrote. And of course, I revised extensively. But when I landed on that line, it's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
I mentioned at the opening that you have a new album out, and from that album, I think we should hear in this moment the song you wrote and performed called Fear.
I release you, my beautiful and terrible fear. I release you. You were my beloved and hated twin, but now I don't know you as myself. I release you with all the pain I would know at the death of my children. You are not my blood anymore. I give you back to the soldiers who burned down my home, beheaded my children. I give you back to those who stole the food from our plates when we were starving. I release you, fear, because you hold these scenes in front of me, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you, I release you, I release you, I release you. I am not afraid to be angry.
And Joy, I gather, either physically or emotionally, you have felt every single one of those fears.
I am not afraid to be full. I am not afraid to be hated. I am not afraid to be loved, to be loved, to be loved. Well, they all seem to be living in that poem, or the acknowledgement of that. I forget how intense it is, and especially to hear it where I'm not just speaking it. It was one of the earliest poems I wrote. And again, it does help. I've heard from many people it helps move through those challenging moments. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or in my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart.
Now a quick break. When we return, the rest of my conversation with Joy Harjo.
Come here, fear. I am alive. And you are so afraid of dying. I release you. I release you. I release you. I release you.
Hi, it's Diane. For the March meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club, I'll host a conversation with author Amy Bloom about her new book, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. It's Friday, March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Find out more and register at dianerehm.org/book club. And we're back. Here's the rest of my conversation with Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States. This conversation was recorded in front of a live audience on Zoom as part of the Diane Rehm Book Club. When you were asked to be the Poet Laureate of the United States, tell me what your internal reaction was.
It was not that I've ever been hit by lightning, but it was something like that. I teased Rob Casper of the Poetry and Literature Center that he tricked me because, he also, his department also runs the National Book Festival, and my book of poetry, An American Sunrise, was coming out. And so I thought, okay. He just said, I have a quick question, is this time work? So he called me and I said, hey, Rob. And the next thing you know, he says, we're on a speakerphone and I have Dr. Carla Hayden, head librarian of Congress here. And I was thinking, what's going on? And then when she asked me, it just, it was like I was stunned. And then my mind clicks in. My mind clicks in. It's like, I don't know. This is going to be a lot of, I'm already really busy. It's like, I've already got, so how am I going to do this? And well, what a responsibility. And then I just said, yes. It's been amazing. I mean, it is an incredible honor to be a kind of ambassador, the appointed ambassador of poetry for the country.
Ambassador of poetry is the perfect way to put it.
Yeah, that's how I see the position, like I'm holding open the door. But what's also happened out of it that's wonderful is the attention toward Native people, not just poets, but Native people, and also Native poets. And as I say, I'm not the only one. There are many of us. This group called Illuminative has come through with some statistics, but something like 20% of Americans believe that we aren't here anymore, that we're all dead.
Wow.
Yeah. And I remember a guitar player I play with frequently, Larry Mitchell, said he grew up in Bed-Stuy, I think, and he was told in school, that's what he grew up learning in school, is that there were no more natives left.
You were invited to be the Poet Laureate, and now you're serving your third term. What has it been like for you? What's involved? Have you traveled the country, speaking at schools, talking about not only poetry, but Native American poetry?
Yes, as I was told, well, there's no job description. Every poet makes it their own. So for some people, they enjoy the honor for a year, and there's a lot of interviews. There are many interviews. And if you do a second term, you do a project. And I did the project, Living Nations, Living Words, that's up on the site. It's a digital project with, it also has a teacher's component, teacher's toolkit, and a book that came out, an anthology of Native poets, contemporary Native poets. And if you do a third term, well, there's only been 2 third terms. And mine came about because of COVID, because I've done many Zoom events, but I could not travel. I was hindered in my work generally, because of COVID. But, for years I've traveled about and performed, so that hasn't changed, but it's up the ante, it's up the visibility. And so, yes, that's what I've been doing. I've been doing a lot of that, traveling about and speaking, except at the height of COVID, I was not traveling about. I was home writing a new music album. I wrote Poet Warrior during the pandemic. We put out Living Nations, Living Words, and I'm working on a musical.
Oh my, a musical. What kind of a musical?
It will be my own version of what a musical is, not a Western musical. It's around the story of a young band of musicians here in Tulsa. Several of them Muskogee Creek, some, different people. African-American, a European-American jazz pianist, a bass player It will show. It will show ultimately. I mean, the young people are dealing with a lot of issues, but it will also show. The music will show how Southeastern Native people were part of the origin story of blues and jazz. Our music, if you hear our traditional music, it's the story becomes very clear. But in this journey they make together with all their different stories coming together, it comes together in the music.
Have you found or encountered any resistance to the fact that you are Native American and you are bringing your own perspective to poetry that people perhaps are not expecting?
Yes, from the beginning, because there are heavy stereotypical expectations about what it is to be Native, which is usually part of the Wild West show, Plains warrior or spiritual leader, or whatever the horrible stereotypes are, or the stereotypes are. Some of them aren't so horrible, but they freeze they freeze people into the place where imagination doesn't live. And yes, I've run into it. I've run into a few places where I taught in different academic institutions at various points. And I remember one of my colleagues coming into it was like my first week teaching at that institution, and comes in, didn't even say knock, hello, can I come in? Comes in, sits on my desk, and proceeds to tell me there are two kinds of poets in the world: refined poets like him, or he called Jacob poets, and then poets who were primitive like me.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, now I think with a little bit of age behind me, I would have been much more vocal about my response, or maybe even physical, but
Do
instead,
you remember what you said to him?
no, I was writing about it the other day in these notes for a new book that will be out next year. Next year will be the 50 years since I published my first poem. But I was writing about this and I thought, well, what did I say to him? But I think I was just, again,
Shocked.
stunned. Yeah, I was stunned that somebody, one, would find it necessary to come in and enforce a hierarchy,
Ah,
and we deal with that hierarchy. And I think for years, anyone who is not European American, there's a hierarchy, even in poetry.
and that brings me to the very next question from one of our listeners who says, does Joy feel conflicted about being the poet laureate of the United States, given the history of the U.S.?
Yes, I've had to deal with that. Of course, that would come up because of the history and my own people being removed physically by gunpoint by soldiers from the United States. I mean, our Muskogee Confederacy, and it was a confederacy of several Southeastern tribes, we dealt with a lot of governments. A lot of the people knew Spanish, French. We dealt with the French, the Spanish, Great Britain, and then the Americans. And the Americans were kind of the toughest. So yes, it can be, seen as, yeah, I have to deal with that
So
because I
you
am
had
here.
to perhaps let go some of that feeling.
Well, the way I think about it is this: you think about how the face of Africa is Africans. In this Western hemisphere, the face of including the United States, is indigenous. And that's how I think about it. The roots, no matter how anyone rewrites the story because of politics, or even cuts our stories out, or makes it illegal to tell our stories. There was a bill that was signed here in Oklahoma that makes it, we're not supposed to talk about our histories. It doesn't mean we're not here. It doesn't mean, the stories, what is true always emerges.
Are you saying that in Oklahoma there are schools where teaching about Native Americans is not permitted?
It's not just Native Americans, it's any story that would make white students, settler students, feel bad about themselves, which is not the important, it's important that all of our stories, where all of our stories are part of this country, all of our stories, every story is part. And then to repress, it's an attempt to repress history or truth telling. So yes, basically the teachers in schools, it's directed at teachers in schools.
Here's another question. Would you talk about the role of animals in Native American poetry?
Well, I guess first I would say there's no Native American. We're all from different tribal communities. Sometimes there's bands, tribal groups, or tribal nations. Those who didn't sign compacts or treaties with the US aren't necessarily nations, but different communities. We all have our own languages, our own belief systems. What unites all of them, though, is a belief that we're in a living universe, and we're all part, we're all an essential part, and no one is above the other. The animals, it's a living, and we have a responsibility to this universe because we're part of it.
Well, in fact, I didn't put it right.
Okay.
She said, would you talk about the role of animals in your story and perhaps beyond?
Yes. So as part of that, animals, plants are living beings, and we're not over them. We walk this earth. Some of them slide, some fly, but we are with them. And so people have, like anybody, we have animals we're close to. We have animals and stories who have helped us. Rabbit in our stories is a trickster figure. I have a new song called Rabbit Invents the Saxophone, because the saxophone is a rowdy instrument, and we have stories about rabbits' tricks, but profoundly, we profoundly exist with them, and there's exchanges with them. But I don't know, there's a lot to get into. I could take over the whole conversation.
Well, in fact, if we had more time, I'd have you read the entire book. It's so beautiful. But there is one thing I do want to ask you about. You write about your own shyness and your desire to stand back. Can you talk about that?
I remember what kind of changed that. I mean, I think we're taught to be, one of the principal teachings. One is anagechka, which is compassion and love and caring for each other. And another is iyaskara, or humility, that, you stand back. But I was told I was the shyest kid at Indian school, which is really shy. And a lot of it was fearful, fear-based, insecurity, even self-hatred at moments. And some of that, historical, personal, et cetera, et cetera. But there was something I read at one point that really shifted that for me, was that shyness was selfishness. And it has to do with the inability, you're not sharing. It's not sharing even the moment in which you are present, but it's, not, you're crossing a line when you're not sharing yourself with others.
You write in the book, I will stand apart at the periphery, watching. I might be seen as cold or shy or strange. It has more to do with a kind of sensitivity honed by experiencing and invading culture and figuring out how to best move to save your life. That's pretty powerful stuff.
Yes. Well, I think about how that is, and how when I went to Indian school, it's the first time I felt free in my classroom. All the students were Native. I think about my grandchildren, particularly two grandsons who are very tall, 6'1", so you see them, and they're very good looking too. And they're very dark skinned, and I worry about them and how they might stand back or not move towards, to be in the present and be absolutely themselves in the present, because it puts them in the line of fire. And that's not the kind of world I want for any of our children, no matter what their culture, skin color, any of that. We all come in to take our place in the story and to make, to be part of this story. And part of that story is challenge. Sometimes it's tremendous challenge. Another moment that shifted for me was when I realized that if a teacher, I was thinking about how teachers test the students that they love most. Sometimes they're the hardest on them. And I thought, well, the Creator must really love Native people, or really love this country, because, of the test. But that's, when I also think about tests and challenge, I think about story and how there is no good story without challenge. I remember one time I had a bad feeling when I got into a taxi, a ride that was taking me to where I had to perform, and I'd come in from flying, and it was midnight, and I asked the driver, it wasn't a taxi, it was a car. I said, "Where are we going?" And he says, "The last stop on the New Jersey Turnpike." And a story ensued there that wound up with me with my two bags and a saxophone on my back, walking along the interstate. And what helped me, I don't have time to go into the whole story, but it involves ghosts and all kinds of stuff, is that I told myself, wow, this is going to make a good story. And that's how I said, when I get through this, and I did, I said, this will make a good story.
Tell me about the part that ghosts play in your creation of poetry.
Probably not as so much ghost as an awareness of spiritual dimensions. I mean, you think about it, and we see, human eyesight. We have these charts, here's ultra, kind of the lower vibrating to the higher vibrate. It extends out beyond what we can normally see or even feel, taste, whatever. Dogs smell, have a better sense of smell, etc. So there are other kinds of dimensions that we experience them sometimes without seeing them, or in our dreams. Our dreams are ways. I see it as kind of dreaming as a traveling portal to gain understanding. I mean, the universe is immense. I would say universes are immense. And I think when you write poetry, when you create, you are interacting. You interact with, even history. The memory of history becomes its own kind of energy place.
Takes me to a question that has been posed for you from a teacher in an alternative high school in Virginia who says, do you have a suggestion on how to motivate reluctant learners to read poetry and participate in the poem writing process? How can I convey the importance of poetry to students who see little value in it?
The way to do that, and years ago, I did poetry in the schools, and I would come into classrooms like that, or the ones where the teachers were ready to run out and said, here, you have them. This is my worst class, and they run away. And then I know they're going to be the best ones because they need to write. And often those that act the most disaffected or think they don't need it are often the ones who need it most. So what I do is you find poems that are relative in the language that they will hear. They're all into such visuals these days. That might be one way to do it is, there's even TikTok poetry, which I haven't seen yet. I've got enough going on, but there's, YouTube poetry. There's all kinds of poetry performances. That's where I would start is in performance with visuals, and then bring in the page and then show them, and then take that poem, a poem that engages them, and then give them a way to write, to make their own poetry.
rather than starting with, for example, the classics. I can recall facing that in high school and not being terribly excited about it.
No, because often those classic poems are written in a different kind of vernacular. And not only, I remember being, we would all just sit there quiet when the teacher would ask after we would read, say, a poem by Longfellow or something, what does the poet mean? And it's like, well, I'm not even sure what we're reading, one, and how do we know what it means? Because he lives way over there another time, and maybe things mean differently then. All these questions would run through all of us, but nobody would say anything because we were stymied. And one way to get there is to find a poem. You could pair up poems, find a poem with a similar theme and say, okay, here, human beings are human beings, no matter what age. We don't seem to learn anything. We're going through the same similar dramas and archetypal stories, but what makes it unique or interesting or different so that it catches our ears and our imagination in a fresh way.
Is there another poem you'd like to read for us?
Oh, wow. Let's see. Maybe I can read part of the poem is too long, but I wrote a poem for my mother, washing my
I was
mother.
going to ask you about her and how she died.
It was 10 years ago, and she had lung cancer. And her brothers taught her to smoke when she was about 9 or 10, so she wouldn't tell on them. They were smoking, and she smoked heavily and then stopped about the last 10 years of her life, but she was smoked constantly. And she never complained. So I knew when she said it hurt that it was pretty bad. So I got to spend the last few months with her, and even the hospice workers said, she doesn't look like someone who's dying, and she didn't. She had a tremendous life force. But the cool thing was, we got to make our peace, and I was there with her when she moved to the next world, and she was relieved, but she did not want to. She saw what was possible, and she was like that. So when she passed, and I was there there with her body, I was singing to her, and there's kind of an earth body. And next thing I know, these strangers in suits come in to take her body. And that's so disruptive. It should be family. And I wanted to wash her body. And but the other family members had already called these guys, and I didn't want discord. I think it's really important when you get to places of tremendous transformative power, like what we're going through in this country right now, is discord disrupts the sacred presence of shift. And so I didn't disrupt. I thought it's a tender moment. If you've ever been present at the birth of a child, it's such a tender, powerful moment where at birth, death is present. Well, the same thing happens at birth, at death. Birth was so present there. It was just shining in its presence. And so I walked with them when they took my mother's body. I just followed her and stood at attention outside in prayer for her as they took her body away. So it wasn't until I was hard at work on this other book dealing with history, and particularly my father's mother's line, and going through that this poem happened. And I thought, wow, that's what happens if we have something we want to do. It'll come out in some way. But it also taught me that a lot of people are haunted. If you talk about ghosts, some of us are like ghosts because we're so haunted. You can be haunted. Well, I should have said this, or I didn't do this.
Yes.
Well, you can do it in a poem. And in the poem, I got to wash her body. So I'll just read a few stanzas from here.
Please.
It's a long poem.
Please.
I never got to wash my mother's body when she died. I returned to take care of her in memory. That's how I make peace when things are left undone. I go back and open the door. I step in to make my ritual, to do what should have been done, what needs to be fixed so that my spirit can move on. so that the children and grandchildren are not caught in a knot of regret they do not understand. And now I'm going to skip. As I wash my mother's face, I tell her how beautiful she is, how brave, how her beauty and bravery live on in her grandchildren. Her face is relaxed, peaceful. Her earth memory body has not left yet. But when I see her the next day, embalmed and in the casket in the funeral home, it will be gone. Where does it go? It is heavier than the spirit who lifted up and flew. I think of it as making the rounds to every place it has loved to say goodbye. Goodbye to the house where I brought my children home, she sings. Goodbye to June's bar, where I was the shuffleboard queen. I cannot say goodbye yet. I will never say goodbye. And let's see, I want to read. I make the final ring of the washcloth and drape it over the pan. Again, I skipped over several stanzas. I brush my mother's hair and kiss her forehead. I ask the keepers of the journey to make sure her travel is safe and sure. I ask the angels with whom she loved and with whom she spoke frequently to take her home. But wait, not before I find her favorite perfume. Then I sing her favorite song softly. I don't know the name of the song, just a few phrases. One of those old homemade heartbreak songs where there's a moment of happiness wound through. And then I let her go.
Would it have been easier for you to let her go had you been able to truly wash her body, or did the poem help you to let go of that sadness?
The poem helped me. It's because it's really about presence, being present, being a witness, and participating as a witness. And the poem allowed me one of the major ingredients of poetry is time. It's major. It's like, as a painter, you gesso the canvas. And I think with a poet, you cover it, there's time, and then you play in time. And so it allowed me to do what the actual washing of her body would have done, I think.
Beautiful. Joy Harjo, thank you so much for being with us. Congratulations on your third term as Poet Laureate of the United States, and whatever you do next, I know I'll be looking for. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here with you, and for all that you've done in telling the American story.
That was my December 2021 conversation with Joy Harjo, Poet Laureate of the United States and author of Poet Warrior. And that's all for today. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or send us an email, trpodcast@wamu.org. Our theme music is composed by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. The show is produced by Allison Brody. Our engineer is Adrian Danhauser. And a special thanks today to our events manager, Yanlin Zhang, as well as Verendra Silva, Julia Slattery, April Stevens, and Lynn Kronberger. Thanks for listening all. Be well, stay safe. I'm Diane Rehm.